All right, can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Very good. I am based in Bremen, Maine, and I'm coming to you to celebrate with you 50 years of Project Puffin. Our goal is to advance the science of seabird conservation while encouraging protection and appreciation of birds worldwide. So our offices are in Bremen, Maine, and if you've ever gone to Hog Island Audubon Camp, it's just off the shore there. So it's part of our compound. It's here where we work on our seabird islands offshore. We have an archipelago of 8 islands, I like to think about. We have the Hog Island Audubon Camp. You can see up there in the middle. I don't know if my arrow shows up. But down from that is Eastern Egg Rock, the first restored seabird colony in the world. And then 6 other seabird islands that we work on. We also have a visitor center up in Rockland, Maine. So our main goals are conservation of birds, research, education, and taking action for them. This is the beautiful Hog Island Audubon Camp. It's located just a 1/4 mile offshore. So this was the first conservation camp in the country. And it welcomes adults and families and teen campers these days. Over the many years, since it's been around for so long, we've had a lot of different kinds of programming, sometimes youth campers. The teen camp is really well attended. Seems like those slots fill up within hours of opening registration. So if you have any teen campers in your midst and you want to save them a spot, take that into account. But also the adults really get an amazing experience here. This has always been a place for top-notch naturalists, famous ornithologists to come. Since the very beginning, Roger Torrey Peterson was one of the first instructors here. This is an old photo. We have a different boat now that we use, but these buildings are still there being used. The Queen Mary, the one that the dock is attached to, has been raised just recently. We raised it up 3 feet higher to take climate change into account, which is lucky because this past storm really walloped our coast. And the campers at Hog Island, we call them the campers, although they get to live in luxurious dorm rooms. They get to experience all of the Maine coast. So they're studying ecosystems, which include birds, but invertebrates and seaweed and spruce fir forests. And they get to really get their hands into everything. They go out on boat trips. This is a family camp expedition. So if you have a grandkid or a kid who you'd like to bring along, it's a very fun time. And this is where Steve Kress, the founder of Project Puffin, got his start when he was just a young fella as a bird life instructor. But you can still find him on Hog Island today. And if you come to the right session, he could be your instructor. Well, the story of Project Puffin, we have to really go back in time. Certainly, people have been using seabirds as food resources since they arrived after the glaciers retreated. But it was really when the Europeans started coming in that things got a little harder for the birds. The first naturalists on the ships, there was one on the ship Archangel who wrote that there are blizzards of birds on the main islands. And if you ever go to a seabird island, you know that when they're frightened, they'll go up in the air if they need to attack an intruder. And it is really like a blizzard. Not only those feathers of white swirling around, but the guano dropping on your head and all the screams. It's a chaos. So people early on, the Europeans thought, well, this is a very good resource for us. We can gather these eggs that are right out on the surface of the island. And the way that eggers would work is they would come out to the island, break all the eggs, and then after a few days, when there were fresh eggs to collect, they would collect them. So things like this were really hard on the seabirds, since seabird eggs are typically very large for the size of the bird. It takes a lot of energy to make those eggs, and the birds are going to respond to the destruction of their eggs by laying more. So they probably would lay 3 clutches and really wear themselves out. People would also catch puffins for meat, and the other seabirds with puffins, since they nest underground, you can lay nets over the rocks. And in the morning, when they come out from their burrows, they would be easily caught in nets. Here's one down in its burrow. And then really most wastefully, it was the fashion for women to wear feathers and whole birds on their hats. And so really the devastation was just amazing. People killing birds in Maine on the islands, shipping them down to Boston to the milliners. So that in the end, by 1900, most of Maine's seabirds were gone. And the skies were empty. But the islands were still there. So this is a beautiful little seabird island, Eastern Egg Rock, right down the bay, right down Muscongas Bay from Hog Island. It's a perfect little island, you can see, because it's got a border of rocky boulders, and it has a raspberry heart, or low grass would be ideal. It has a low vegetation in the middle. No tall trees for predatory owls to perch in. It's out in the water far from the mainland, so fewer predators from the mainland can get there. It's hopefully surrounded by an ocean full of fish. Those puffins used to be on that island. Steve thought, wouldn't it be great if we could get puffins back on that island and share them with the Audubon campers and just increase the biodiversity of this area? So he really had to understand the biology of puffins to make a plan for them. One thing about puffins is they do like to be in groups. They are very tied to their home island. They spend most of their lives at sea. Really, they are creatures of the sea. So they're out there in all sorts of weather. They're out there all winter. The young ones are out until they need to come back to land to find a mate and lay an egg, and that might be 4 or 5 years. So they are truly aquatic. When they do come back to land, in Maine, they find little rocky crevices where they can make a safe nest. In some places further east, in Canada and Iceland, they dig burrows into the sod, very deep burrows. But our islands are such that the rocks provide their habitat. So they lay one single egg, a white egg, kind of like a chicken egg, and both parents take turns incubating it. Then they both help rear the chick. It takes about 6 weeks of incubation, and then about 6 weeks more to raise that chick. It's interesting how birds that are colored the same, the male and female puffins, look quite similar, really exactly the same, except on average, the males can have a little bit bigger beaks, but you can't tell just looking at a single puffin. So those jobs those birds who have very similar jobs, they tend to have similar plumage, whereas birds like ducks who have very different plumages, the males and females provide different jobs to their families. So this is an adorable little puffin chick. Those little puffin chicks are down in the burrow. After about 3 days, they can thermoregulate on their own, but sometimes one parent will stay with them to keep them company, to preen them. Otherwise, depending on how much fish is around, that is the thing. So if it's a bad fish year and they need to search far and wide, then both parents may be out of the burrow at the same time. The chick can just stay down there. It's relatively safe. It's certainly out of the weather. Sometimes a neighboring puffin might come in, and so that's one thought, is that a parent staying behind can protect the burrow better. But this little chick stays down in its burrow, only coming out if a researcher wants to band it or weigh it or something. they stay down there until it's time for them to leave the island. So when they're 6 weeks old, in the middle of the night, they run out over the rocks down to the sea and swim away without their parents. This is always a shocking thing when I say that to the children. So you can see this little bird on the left, that's a 1-year-old puffin. And they'll just stay out there. You could see that when they leave, they are certainly not colored like an adult puffin. Their face is darker, their beak is darker, their feet are gray. They're more about camouflage than about communication and sex appeal. So the bird on the right is a couple of years old, and it's back on the island just to visit. It's too young to have a mate yet, but it's sometimes they come back to visit their home island. So one key thing is that they virtually always come back to the islands where they hatched, where they fledged from. So Steve thought about all these things and figured, well, we could probably be puffin parents. It can't be as hard as raising an actual kid. And so in 1973, he began this experiment. Now, it's really hard to persuade puffins to come to this island that they have been gone from for more than 100 years. So he had an elaborate plan to go to Canada, get young puffin chicks, 10-day-old puffin chicks that were old enough to keep themselves warm, but could travel. And it turned out that it was not that hard to raise puffin chicks. If you get them about 10 days old, they're quite strong, fat and healthy. So there were artificial burrows made on Eastern egg rock, made in the sod. Each puffin chick is always an only child, so each one had their own burrow. You can see a little wire door there that's propped up. For the first few days, week, the little door is shut during the daytime, just in case the chick is confused. But after that, it was left open, and the chicks, they don't come out in the daytime. They know that is a dangerous time to come out. You could get eaten by a gull or who knows what. So they stay down in the burrow, and these chicks were fed and their burrows cleaned out by the research assistants until they got to fledging age. So this little guy, you can see it's fully feathered, the gray beak, the gray face, the gray feet. This bird is ready to go. So one morning we would go out to check them and the bird would be gone. Off to sea it went. And we know that the parents don't go with them because the parents are still hanging out on the island. They kind of visit each other's burrows, maybe defend their own because they're going to come back to that burrow next year. Rest up from that arduous chick rearing time. And yeah, so they're hanging out. Soon though, all the puffins will be gone from the island. In the winter, the island is empty of all these seabirds. They migrate off into the ocean, somewhat south, depending on the species. But the interesting thing that Steve started thinking about is that puffins, when they come back to an island, they really depend on seeing other birds there. The social cues of seeing a crowd of puffins are really important. These puffins in a group, there's usually hundreds or thousands of puffins on big colonies. And so that shows the other birds that this is a place you can be successful. You may find a mate here. There must be food to raise a chick. It's all the good things. It says, you know, you wouldn't go to a restaurant with no cars in the parking lot. And the same with a puffin. So he, after a few years where it was just waiting and thinking about puffins coming back, you know, we didn't expect them for a few years until they were old enough. He put out these decoys to see if that would spur them to stay. They had seen some flybys, but then as soon as they put the decoys out, the puffins started landing. And then once you have a couple of puffins landing, the puffins themselves are the decoys for the other birds. This is a tern decoy. So he was thinking, what other species can we get to live with these puffins? Who could get along well? The island had been kind of taken over by large gulls who had really been the only types of birds who rebounded on their own from those hard bird hunting years. So terns have a really different biology. Now they are much more wings on, so to speak, with their chicks. So they are nesting out in the open, and they have to protect their kids. But they're also a very vocal species. So using the decoys and a sound system like this is a solar recharged sound system that would play tern calls 24 hours a day. It sounds like a tern colony. Terns as groups, they sometimes go searching for a new site. Say they are nesting on an island where there's very poor success or there's been a predator. Sometimes they will get up as a group and look for a new place. So if they found an island that looked like it was open for business and there were terns there, they might decide to check that one out. So finally, the puffins were back, but they had not shown him the true sign of success, which was carrying fish into the rocks. And so finally in 1981, there was a puffin with fish. There was great rejoicing because that meant puffins were really breeding. They'd really settled into this island for the first time in more than 100 years. And you can see this is a graph of common terns and puffins and how they're doing on Eastern Egg Rock. There was kind of a long period initially where it seemed that there were only around 20, 24 puffin pairs on the island. And people wondered, well, you know, this is the southernmost puffin colony. Maybe this is all this habitat can support, or maybe this is all the fish can support. But then we had a really huge increase up with the puffins and the terns. So things are looking pretty good. The experiment was then repeated on Seal Island. This is Seal Island National Wildlife Refuge, which was purported to be the mother of all seabird colonies. It's of about 80 acres in size, huge in outer Penobscot Bay. And he translocated a lot of puffin chicks down to this island. With all those translocations of chicks, we had really high, it was like 99% survival of the chicks. So we were very good at being puffin parents. So here's Seal Island up at the right, furthest northeast island that we work on. Some of those other islands, which I'll mention, Matinicus Rock, just below Seal Island, that is the island where supposedly the last pair of puffins in Maine was still left. We were down to one pair of puffins in all of Maine, was the story, you know, more or less. So that was the only spot that was left. And that island was protected because it was a lighthouse island. And they hired the lightkeeper in 1900, the group that later became Audubon Society, hired the lightkeepers to protect the birds from the feather hunters. So the lighthouse keepers and the bird keepers were one at that time. These other islands further southwest, Pond Island, Jenny, Outer Green, and Stratton Island, these were all tern restoration sites. So here's a common tern with its beautiful fledgling. The same techniques, which were now known as social attraction techniques, were used here. Decoys and sound systems were put out, and terns respond very quickly to that. They are so social, so loud. In the midst of all this work, staffing all these islands, Steve really attracted a lot of interesting people of all ages, volunteers and students and young professionals, old professionals, all kinds of people. So really his skill at social attraction is not limited to birds. Here's one of those islands. This is Pond Island, a beautiful little island where now there are successfully nesting common terns, and a few Arctics and even roseates. So people are settled into these field sites now. This is our little kitchen area. With one of our international fellows. We have a whole international fellows program. This guy was from China. And a lot of people are coming here to learn our techniques, and sometimes we get to go there, learn their techniques, help them on their projects. And so this is a typical field camp. It's we're living outside, basically. People are sleeping in tents. We have this little seasonal structure that's our kitchen. We have a propane refrigerator. We carry our water. We carry in our food and our propane. It's really simple, but perfect. And so the researchers on the islands now that we've really restored the colonies, their job is to monitor the colonies and learn as much as we can about things. Here's some people conducting a nest census. Every year on all the islands, we go through arms width apart and count every single egg on the island, all the different species. So upper left corner going clockwise, we have common terns, we have laughing gulls, we have a common tern with weird eggs, and then the eider duck in the lower left in a beautiful downy nest. We keep track of how many of the eggs hatch in some of our study plots, and then how many chicks fledge. So this gives us a really good indication of how healthy the ecosystem is and what we really need to watch out for. These birds can tell us so much about the state of the environment. It's hard for people we could certainly measure the water temperature, but it's very hard to study forage fish, for instance, the young juvenile fish. And the seabirds are the most perfect surveyors of those fish because they're catching tiny little fish for their chicks. All these birds bring fish to their chicks, and the chicks have to swallow them whole. So they have to be the right size. And when things are perfect and the fish are aligned properly with the season of the birds, it works. Now, when the water temperature changes, sometimes the migration of the fish changes, or the timing of those hatches of the fish and the spawning, and that can be a problem. So we take careful notes on how many fish are brought in, what species they are, what size they are. And then we measure the chicks so we can see how they are growing on the diet of that year. She's weighing that little tern chick in an onion bag. And then we want to see not only how many birds leave the island, but how many make it back. Because this is a mystery a lot of the times. What happens to them once they go out to sea? Those terns, some of those terns fly all the way to Antarctica. The puffins, they go out to sea far and wide. They don't go so far south as a tern, certainly, but they experience a lot of dangers that we might not know about. Toxins in the water, storms, lack of fish is a big one. So you can see these are the survival rates of puffin chicks from Matinicus Rock, and it varies quite a lot. So some of these years, 1989 was a terrible year, 20% came back. But then in the 90s, we had a number of years that were very good, more than 90% survival rate on some of those years. Since these seabirds are very long-lived, and they don't start breeding till pretty late, a puffin could live till it's 36 years old. This is part of the strategy of these birds. They can have some off years as long as they have some good years, and as long as the adults survive. Adult survival is pretty high. It is the young fledglings that have the worst survival because they're learning everything as they go. But as long as we have some good years, that's good. Now, lately we have had more not as good years, so that's concerning. But we are doing everything we can. Now, we can't control everything in the ocean. We can't easily control climate change, but we can make the habitat on our islands as good as we can get it. A lot of introduced plants grow on these islands. The birds fertilize them. They get very tall and thus sort of create habitat that is not as good for them as it was at one point. The terns like to nest in fairly low vegetation so that they can fly in and out with their food fish for the chicks. The chicks like to have a little bit of shady cover, but they want to be able to get to an open spot to get their food. So we lay out these hemp mats. We do a lot of weeding. We try to reduce the invasive species of plants out there. So we're pulling up wild radish and bittersweet on some of the islands. There's a lot of weeding that goes on out there. These are biodegradable hemp mats that were put down. You can see some little chick shelters out there on them. So there's a lot of habitat management because that's something that we can do. And if you get a year where you can produce a lot of chicks, it makes a big difference. And then one thing that we're doing is we lay down those mats, hopefully to kill the invasive species and the tall grasses, the tall European grasses. And then we're trying to grow low growing grasses, which are much better for tern survival. So we're tern farming with the low grasses. And this is just a perpetual job. This is on Jenny Island. And then we want to keep our islands clean. So I'm sure that the storms that we just had in January are really going to refill our marine debris zone. So we spend a lot of time picking up marine debris. You know, it's a danger for entanglement issues. If it's small bits, they might ingest them. It's just not good. So we literally pick up tons and tons of marine debris. We took 13 tons off of Stratton Island. Actually, this batch that this lobster boat is taking away doesn't even count in that 13 tons. That was another time when we had 2 dumpsters and a landing craft to help us. And we had a tractor to crush the traps. Much of the marine debris is lobster gear and fishing gear that's torn up and washed ashore. So now our islands are doing quite well. I mean, every year is a little different. We always worry whether the fish will be okay. We worry about whether there will be a storm at the wrong time. But you know, the islands themselves, we're working hard to make them the best sort of habitat we can. So we have Arctic terns, common terns, roseate terns, least terns, all of these nesting in our little archipelago of islands. And then we have the alcids. We have guillemots, black guillemots, adorable razorbills. And we even have common murres now nesting on Matinicus Rock. We were putting out social attraction tools there for quite some time, and we did attract a lot of birds. I think they were mainly youngsters heading to Canada, but then the razorbills and potentially the decoys, we don't really know, but they settled in amongst the razorbills and started breeding. So we have a small colony there. We have common eiders. Notice how the male and female common eider look very different. She does all the child rearing. They nest in the sort of short vegetation underneath angelica plants or overhanging rocks. And eiders really have a lot of human pressures put on them. They're still a hunted species. The large gulls, which benefit from the people food that they find and the lobster bait tossed back, large gulls will prey on their ducklings a lot. So they really have a tough time, but we're trying to provide as much safety for them as we can. And then there's storm petrels, Leach's storm petrels nesting under the sod. So these islands are like a layer cake, just layers and layers of different birds. The puffins and the guillemots and the razorbills under the rocks, the little Leach's storm petrels in the sod. And then on Matinicus Rock, we have fairly recently had this Manx shearwater colony, just a tiny collection of Manx shearwaters. Most of them nest on the eastern Atlantic side over in Skomer and Stockholm Islands in Britain. There's some in Iceland. So just a handful in this side of the ocean. They are really amazing. They nest also digging burrows in the side. And great cormorants nest on seal islands. They are really rare in Maine. Here we had this one spirit bird all in white a couple of years ago. So we try to keep the eagles from eating these. That seems to be the biggest hurdle for their success. It's been 50 years. We've really done so many things. We have 7 healthy seabird islands that we're managing. Pretty cool. From our humble beginnings in a tent to our humble present in a cabin. It's called the Egg Rock Hilton. Now we're learning more and more about what the birds do when they're off the island. So technologies are allowing us to learn not just what they're doing on the island, which is a small part of their life, but what they're doing off the island. So this is a geolocator on a puffin lake. And we learned after no one knew where the puffins went, we found out that they go down sort of southeast of New York to an area which Barack Obama protected as a marine protected area. Arctic terns, of course, are the master migrants of the bird world. And by tagging them, we have amazing information about their route. It's hard to believe that these little birds, who's, they hatch in July, and then by August, these young birds are flying off to end up in Antarctica this year. And the adults do this every year. They fly into the middle of the ocean. You can see that little blue shape. That's a proposed marine protected area, which is really important to a lot of seabirds. They seem to go there to fuel up before undertaking this long, long migration. And then they zip back up to Maine when it's time to breed. That's the Arctic tern. So Keenan Yakola is one of the grad students working on our islands, and he's tagged a number of birds. This is a really interesting tag on a tern. So not only is he getting long migration information from geolocators, but he's also getting data about their shorter foraging trips. So these birds are stuck on an island. Really, they have no choice. There are very few islands, even though there are more than 4,000 islands in Maine, very few of them are suitable for seabirds and fewer historic seabird islands. So the ones that they come to, they're tied there when it's breeding season. They can only go so far to provision their chicks. And so he's getting information about common and Arctic terns and where they forage. I think the common tern is supposed to be the yellow. This is really key right now because they are planning wind power projects in the Gulf of Maine. And so by having a little bit more information to provide about what's important habitat to another species, this is really valuable. So he's gathering this up currently and getting it into the wind power process. And just last year, he started also surveying the storm petrels with tags. So these storm petrels, they nest in the sod. This is their chick, so fluffy. They go under there. They have to incubate the eggs for about 45 days, and then they have to care for the chick for 65 days. Now, unlike the other birds, these guys go out and catch little amphipods, tiny fish, ingest them and digest. It creates a very calorie-rich oil in their crop that they come back and give to the chick. They regurgitate for the chicks. So these guys, they have to travel very far. They do 3-day jaunts, 3 or 4 day jaunts between feedings. Both parents are out there getting food for the chick. And he calculated using this nanotag technology that a storm petrel needs to travel the distance equal to going around the Earth to raise a chick on its foraging runs. So you can see it really travels far. There's Cape Cod. It's traveling from Maine all the way to Cape Cod and past out to the edge of Georgia's Bank, the continental shelf. Some of these areas are protected. This is the Northeast Canyons and Seamounts National Monument. And that is, this is kind of the area where the puffins winter too. So there's a lot of really important habitat. We don't really know how the wind power is going to impact that, but it's good that we're learning more and putting that into the mix. So in terms of sharing all this information that's so amazing with other people, we have some live cams that you can watch on explore.org. And there's a puffin cam in a burrow, so you can watch a chick grow up in the summer. Right now, those puffin cams have turned into seal cams on Seal Island, and you can tune in and watch live seals, gray seals, pupping. We also take our gig to the schools sometimes. We've educated thousands of kids. A lot of these are coastal kids with fishing families, so they come in with a certain set of knowledge, and then we can provide a little bit different knowledge, and they can take that home and talk to their folks. They really love to be a puffin, learn about puffins. Who doesn't? A puffin is a perfect ambassador animal because they are so cute and funny, and in real life they really are interesting, and it appears they have a sense of humor. So from this small island in Maine, we've really spread to the world, especially the social attraction techniques, using the decoys and the sound for something benevolent rather than shooting birds. This was a first. And now it's been used all over the world. These are Chinese crested terns, highly endangered. They were thought to be extinct, and then they found a handful of them. And the idea was to use the social attraction tools to concentrate them so they could more easily find a mate. And here's some bridled terns down in Puerto Rico, Caspian terns in Oregon. A lot of these birds were either extirpated from historic nesting areas, or they needed to be communicated with about alternate nesting areas. Some of their nesting areas have been destroyed, and we just want to show them a safe place to be. The albatrosses in Kauai, they need to have areas where they're not getting eaten by the neighborhood dogs. And amazingly, in 2017, we were offered the Mad River decoy business. So Jim Henry had founded this and started making conservation decoys out of rotomolded plastic, as he was a canoe maker who used that method. And when it was time for him to retire, he offered us the business. So we drove to Vermont and picked up some ovens and plastic and molds, and now we are shipping birds out all over the world. It's really exciting. These are gannets going to Australia, and Chinese and greater crested terns going to South Korea. I get to spend a lot of time in my paint shop just pondering the best way to make a bird seem right. Now, of course, this is just from my human perspective, but sometimes like just a little spot of white in the right place makes it feel right to me. It's hard to know what the bird is thinking. They're actually pretty, they're smart. They have good eyesight, and they can understand the symbolism, even of a bird that is not perfectly the right shade of gray or even the right shape. The basic thing is that they understand that, and we're able to communicate with them. And we have a lot of fun just trying out different things. These are tufted puffins with various hairdos. So the sun has not set on Project Puffin. Even though it has been 50 years, we are just getting going. The future is so bright, we gotta wear shades. We had everybody wearing their shades at our 50th anniversary gathering this past summer. Lots of people have been involved in this program. people on the islands, people who are fundraisers, just everybody is involved. So it's a big pleasure to be involved also.